Anatomy and Physiology 1, Cranial Nerves. There are 12 pairs of cranial nerves. These nerves arise from the brainstem, and with one major exception, they supply sensory and motor function to structures within the head and neck. We'll talk about that exception later. They're considered part of the peripheral nervous system, and they emerge from specific foramina in the skull. Shown here are the origins of the 12 pairs of cranial nerves, and based on where they arise is how we order them when we're naming them. Each cranial nerve is given a Roman numeral designation. Again, this is based on where they arise within the brainstem. The cranial nerves are named after their function. The first pair are the olfactory nerves, followed by the optic and oculomotor, the trochlear and trigeminal, abducens and facial, vestibulocochlear and glossopharyngeal, vagus, accessory, and hypoglossal. The nerves can also be categorized as to whether they are primarily sensory nerves, motor nerves, or both. The olfactory and optic nerves are examples of sensory nerves. They're primarily sensory receptors for smell and vision. Ocular, motor, and trochlear are primarily motor nerves in that they operate muscles that move the eye. And the trigeminal is an example of a nerve that does both. There are a couple mnemonic devices for remembering the names and orders of the nerves and their function. On Old Olympus's towering top, a friendly Viking grows vines and hops. Those are for the names and their ordering. And as for their function, S for sensory, M for motor, and B for both. Some say marry money, but my brother says big brains matter more. The first pair of cranial nerves are the olfactory nerves. You can see the olfactory bulbs here underneath the cerebrum, the frontal lobe of the cerebrum. And also extending down from the olfactory bulbs, you can see the olfactory neurons that they synapse with. These are the actual olfactory receptors. If you remember back to the skull, the ethmoid bone has a porous superficial surface called the cribriform plate, and it allows for the extension of these olfactory neurons down into the nasal cavity. So here you can see the olfactory bulbs flanking the crista galli on the ethmoid bone, and the neurons extending down into the nasal cavity. The second pair of cranial nerves are the optic nerves. They transmit information from the retinas. Shown here, the pair of optic nerves and some of the axons cross at the optic chiasm or optic chiasma. And they extend out from the back of the eye. The third pair of cranial nerves are called the ocular motor nerves, and they're considered motor nerves. They arise from the midbrain, and they pass through the orbits where they innervate a number of voluntary muscles like the eyelids and 4 of the 6 muscles that move the eye. And they also innervate some involuntary muscles that adjust how much light enters the eye. For the remainder of the cranial nerves, we'll look at a little more detail at the specific site that they arise from. And because they come in pairs, we can get rid of half of them, so we'll get rid of all the ones on the right for clarity. And we've already looked at the olfactory and optic nerves, as well as the ocular motor nerves. The left one shown here. It arises from the midbrain. The fourth cranial nerve is called the trochlear nerve, and it also arises from the midbrain. It's considered a motor nerve, and it innervates one muscle that moves the eye, called the superior oblique. Although it's a motor nerve, there are some proprioceptive fibers. The largest of the cranial nerves is number 5, the trigeminal nerve. It arises from the pons, and it's a mixed nerve. It has both motor and sensory function. There's 3 major divisions: the ophthalmic, maxillary, and mandibular, that innervate different areas of the head. The 6 pericranial nerves are called the abducens. They arise from the pons, and they innervate a muscle that moves the eye called the lateral rectus muscle. They're considered motor nerves, although they also have some proprioceptive fibers. The 7th pericranial nerves are called the facial nerves. They arise from the pons, they emerge on the sides of the face, and they have both motor and sensory function. They're also mixed nerves. The motor fibers innervate muscles of facial expression, whereas the sensory branches receive impulses from taste receptors on the tongue. And this nerve also controls secretions from the tear and some salivary glands. The 8th pericranial nerves are the vestibulocochlear nerves. They're sensory nerves, and they're associated with structures in the inner ear. They conduct impulses associated with the sense of equilibrium and the sense of hearing. The 9th pericranial nerves are the glossopharyngeal nerves. They arise from the medulla oblongata, and they're mixed nerves. They have both motor and sensory function. The motor fibers conduct impulses to the salivary glands as well as muscles in the pharynx that are important for swallowing. The sensory fibers conduct impulses from the posterior portion of the tongue, the tonsils, the pharynx, as well as the carotid arteries. The 10th pericranial nerves are the vagus nerves. These arise from the medulla oblongata, and they descend down into the thoracic and abdominal cavity. This is the exception that was mentioned at the beginning of the movie in terms of nerves that operate on structures that lie outside of the head and neck. It's a mixed nerve. The sensory fibers transmit impulses from the larynx, pharynx, esophagus, and viscera of the thorax and abdomen. And the motor fibers conduct impulses to muscles important for speech and swallowing, as well as viscera of the thoracic and abdominal cavities. The 11th cranial nerve is the accessory nerve, and it's primarily motor. It conducts impulses to muscles of the pharynx, larynx, soft palate, and muscles in the neck and back. The 12th cranial nerve is the hypoglossal nerve. It is also primarily a motor nerve, and it innervates muscles of the tongue. This video has covered the 12 cranial nerves, where they arise from, their names, and their general functions.